So I'll start formally, and I will say thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Heather Grin, and I am the Rare Book Curator here at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. And it is my honor to introduce Dr. James Russell, who has a high degree of expertise into this incredible incunabula text, the Hypnerotomachia Poliphili. Thank you so much, James.
Thank you so much, Heather. So in the Grosvenor Rare Book Room of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, there are some amazing treasures. A Shakespeare First Folio and the original manuscript of Huckleberry Finn, to name a few. Today I'd like to share with you a bit more about what may be the weirdest and most beautiful book in the collection. It's a book of dreams and also a love story, and also an alchemical treatise, and also an encyclopedia. A book that defies categorization. It's the Hypnerotomachia Poliphili, a name that translates as the strife of love in a dream of he who loves many things. And this inscription on the front page reads, the strife of love, where it is shown that all human things are nothing but a dream. So we had some pronunciation practice earlier on. So I wonder if you maybe follow along. I wish I had a bouncing ball here. So Hypnerotomachia Poliphili. And it comes from three roots. Upnos, which means sleep in Greek, eros, romantic love, and machia, or strife, or conflict. I first encountered this book as a master's student at a seminar, and it changed my life. It redirected the course of my research and my experience. It's taken me to places like the Vatican, the British Library, and to the wonderful city of Buffalo, where 12 years ago I got to examine this copy in person, and never would have expected that 12 years later I'd be giving a presentation on it. I did my PhD in the history of the book at Durham University in the UK, and I've always loved old books. I remember, I'm dating myself here, I remember when eBay first came out, and I first started buying books off eBay, and my fascination with their books began with movies like The Never-Ending Story and The Page Master for 80s kids. Those captured my imagination with the mystique of old and ancient books, and it's such a blessing to be able to work with them professionally. I'll be sharing about the book, but I'd also like to make this a bit more experiential. So I'd like to invite you, if you're willing, to picture your dream from last night if you remember it. You don't need to share it with anybody, keep it confidential, but if you can, see if you can retain an image from last night's dream. Picture it vividly. See what it might look like from different angles. And hold on to that image because we'll be returning to it throughout the talk. Learning how we can use the Hypnerotomachia not only to have a beautiful experience with an old book, but to make our own experience of our consciousness and our dreams richer and more creative. So I want to show you, So I want to show you a few images just to show the stunning beauty of the woodcuts and the typography of this book. But what really drew my attention are the notes. The Buffalo copy abounds in annotation, with 5 separate hands found in this copy, more than any other copy in the world of which I'm aware. And it's full of bizarre images, such as you would find only in a dream, such as this circle of dancing two-headed figures. This book is one of the or nymphs turning into trees before a king. Yeah. This book is one of the treasures of book collecting, prized by collectors, and has primarily attracted interest up until the 90s as an object of bibliographical connoisseurship. It's one of the most sought-after books on the international market. Copies of this in the past year, 2025, went up for sale at both Sotheby's and Christie's for between 80,000 to 100,000 pounds. The Hypnerotomachia is an example of an incunable, a book from the earliest stages of printing in Europe. Printing was first invented using blocks in Korea in the 3rd century BC, but incunables are those books printed in Europe between 1455 and 1500. The 1455 being the year that Gutenberg published with movable type the famous 42-line Gutenberg Bible, and here's a replica of his press from the International Museum of Printing. What I love about incunabula is that they're in that early stage where they can't quite decide if they're a book or a manuscript yet. They're printed, but they have manuscript elements, such as illuminated capital letters. And you get the best of both worlds in this age of experimentation as with this new communications technology. The Hypnerotomachia is a challenge to read, and it's often dismissed because as unreadable. Part of the reason is that it's written in a constructed language, a made-up language called Polifilesco. Polifilesco combines elements of Italian and Latin without fully blending into either. You can read it if you can read Italian, but it would come off as extremely flowery, over-the-top, ornate, and ostentatious. For example, what I mean by constructed languages, I mean languages that are made up by human design, such as Tolkien's Elvish and Sindarin, Klingon from Star Trek, Dothraki and High Valyrian from Game of Thrones, and the universal language Esperanto. Polifilesco is a constructed language like these. It's been compared to the language of James Joyce that he used in Ulysses and in Finnegan's Wake. So here's an example of Polifilesco. If you have any familiarity with Italian, you can usually pick out what it's saying. This is a description of the dawn and the chariots carrying the sun into view. But it contains words that are grammatically possible, but were never actually used in reality, like crispulavuno. It comes from the root word of crepuscular, meaning the twilight. But it's a word that's grammatically logical, but never actually existed in reality before Polifilesco. But it can be made from Romance language roots. So, what is this book for? Someone wouldn't invest their energy in writing an approximately 350-page book in a constructed language with ornate woodcuts for no purpose. When we look at the book, we're conditioned to expect impenetrability. It looks like something that's inaccessible, but someone clearly invested enough energy in this to make it worth their while. Who was that? Well, the book contains the name of the author in cipher. If you look at the initial capitals of the first 38 chapters, look at the initial capitals there, P-O-L. Does anyone notice a pattern here?
Yes.
Indeed. They spell out a message. And the message reads, Poliam frater Franciscus Colonna paramavit. Brother Francesco Colonna greatly loved Polia. So who is this Francesco Colonna and who is Polia? There are two candidates for who Francesco Colonna could be. One is a Venetian Dominican monk who through a series of scandals failed his way up the ecclesiastical hierarchy to becoming the preacher at St. Mark's. The other is an aristocrat from Palestrina outside of Rome. There's evidence for both, or Francesco Colonna could be a pen name for an anonymous author or a group of authors. We do know this acrostic was known early. It's found in a marginal note in 1516 by Sixtus Medici, who is the first person to record it. And then Ben Jonson used the name Francesco Colonna in one of his masks, his court dramas, Ben Jonson being a contemporary of Shakespeare. So it was the acrostic was known by that point. So here are a few of the possible candidates. Of the candidates, I lean toward it being the Venetian Dominican. And the reason I find this persuasive is that for all its supposedly romantic or even obscene qualities, the Hypnerotomachia is an argument for conversion to love, to give yourself over to love fully. And this resounds with a lot of the rhetoric of the Dominicans, who are the order of preachers. Their job is to convert. And we see Dominican rhetoric coming out in the plot and the argument of the book. Some other evidences that could be the Venetian Dominican are that it contains words in the dialect of Venice, specifically the word squirrel, shuri, which is in Veneto Volgare, the dialect of Venice, localizing the book to that area. The Hypnerotomachia also contains elaborate descriptions of rites, rituals, and liturgical accoutrements, things like braziers or monstrances, the things you would find in a Catholic service. So this is why I'm persuaded that as pagan, as even obscene in some places as the book is, in some interpretations, I think it's the Venetian Dominican. But then who is Polia, the beloved? The word Polia comes from a few possible roots. One being poly, meaning many things. So Poliphilo, the protagonist of the book, his name means lover of many things, and his beloved is indeed many things. Another possibility is the Greek polios, which means gray or gray-haired, symbolizing antiquity, the love of the Renaissance for the unreachable ancient past that they were trying to recover. It also could be a variation on Hippolyta Lelli, a documented young woman who lived in Treviso who Francesco Colonna, the Dominican, may have encountered. So, or it could be a pun on all three, given the degree of linguistic experimentation in the book. So when I was doing my dissertation on this book, I was trying to come up with something new to say about it. Always a challenge. And my doctoral advisor had a wonderful insight for me. He said, when you're stuck on a question, reverse it. So so much ink has been spilled about authorial intent. Who was Francesco Colonna and what did he mean? But could a more interesting question be, how did readers make use of this book? I can't get inside the mind of Francesco Colonna, but I can look at the records of how people made use of this most extraordinary book, because it was a used text. It was not just a marvel to be put on the shelf and admired for its typography. This was a text that was applied, interpreted, remixed, and put out into new forms of art. So, you may have come across the novel The Rule of Four. It was a New York Times bestseller based on the Hypnerotomachia, in which 4 Princeton students discover a code to a hidden treasure within the text. It's a fun novel, but I think this approach that we see in so many things like on the History Channel with historical conspiracies and secrets it's enticing but reductionistic to say there's only one hidden meaning which must be enciphered within the text because it has an acrostic. Instead, what if we looked at the readers who abound in various interpretations, a variety of meanings? This gives us a much more rich aesthetic experience than trying to find one hidden code in the book. So how can I get evidence for readers' experiences? I decided to go looking for marginal notes, the inscriptions that readers wrote in the books themselves. These are called marginalia, and this word was actually coined by Edgar Allan Poe, who was a famous writer in his own books. So I'll give you a moment just to read his opinion on writing in books. Writing in books was completely acceptable up until the beginning of endowed public libraries in the 19th century. It was, in fact, writing in books was considered to be a service for your next reader, clarifying what the text meant and participating in ongoing conversation, kind of like Wikipedia or Reddit, and a discussion board unfolding in the margins of the book. But how could I find marginalia? Fortunately, there was a precedent for this study. An astrophysicist named Owen Gingerich wrote a book called The Book Nobody Read, which became a bestseller. The Book Nobody Read is his story of his lifelong journey to find every copy of Nicholas Copernicus's On Revolutions, or De Revolutionibus, which is the first book to show that the Earth revolves around the sun, the heliocentric hypothesis. Gingerich found a copy almost by chance while attending a Copernicus convention on the 500th anniversary. And he was amazed to find in this copy in Edinburgh that was covered in marginalia, and that the marginalia did not focus exclusively on the sun-centric hypothesis. He thought people would say this crazy book is making this scandalous claim the Earth revolves around the sun, and that's where the annotators would focus. But no, people read this book thoroughly, cover to cover, annotating even the most technical passages on orbits. And so Gingerich has been working on a world census of all annotated copies of De Revolutionibus. So I thought, why not try to do the same for the Hypnerotomachia? I was able to start with a tool called the Incunable Short Title Catalog, which was a project in the 50s to 70s to document every incunable in the world. However, it is woefully out of date. Copies have changed ownership since then. They've been acquired, in some cases destroyed. And to get past the errors in the Incunable Short Title Catalog, I decided instead to write to every single library listed in the catalog as having one, and every single private owner I could identify. And what amazes me continually is the graciousness and generosity of librarians.
Woo!
Certainly. Let's give them a round of applause. I would write to them out of the blue and get back dozens of photocopied pages of a book. Just an amazing generosity of spirit. And out of this survey, I was able to find that about 30% of surviving copies of the Hypnerotomachia have marginalia. So this was not an unread and unreadable book in a strange language. This was a used text among the community of Renaissance scholars. And copies just poured out of the woodwork in places like the Vatican Library, the British Library, and the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. And these three libraries belong in the same breath in the same sentence. This is an extraordinary collection that you have here in Buffalo. I went on a tour with Heather Gring, our Rare Books librarian, earlier today, and was amazed at what the holdings are here. So let me talk about some of the other copies found in the world before delving into Buffalo's remarkable copy, which in some ways outshines even those in the Vatican or the British Library. In the Vatican Library, it's a lot of fun to visit. The Swiss guards salute you when you walk in. And it is not climate controlled with oxygen deprivation like you saw Tom Hanks suffering through in Angels and Demons. It's a rare book library much like any other. And in the Vatican Library, we found a copy annotated by Pope Alexander VII, who is largely the commissioner of the building of what we now call Baroque Rome. He was interested in wordplay in the book. He was interested in in identifying the etymological roots or the word pieces of phrases in Polifilesco. But he also took inspiration for monuments. This monument on the right is called the Pulcino della Minerva, or Minerva's Chick, which is the last monument that Alexander VII built in his lifetime outside of Santa Maria sopra Minerva Church in Rome. And it's drawn, I think persuasively, from this woodcut of the Hypnerotomachia. So we see this text being a generative one, creating new art from it, inspiring people to take this work as a source for new creations. We saw the same thing in the British Library copy, which is annotated by Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's contemporary and friend. Ben Jonson, in his copious marginal notes, writes a long summary of the book, but describes only those features that can be visually represented. He leaves out the love story, he leaves out alchemy, but he writes about things that would look great on stage. So it looks like Jonson and his collaborator, his set designer Inigo Jones, used the Hypnerotomachia as a source for set design for the royal entertainments of masks. But there is some alchemy in the British Library copy, but it's not in Jonson's hand. There's a second hand in the British Library copy that sees the book as an allegory of the alchemical process, with the characters and story elements representing ingredients and laboratory procedures. My colleague James O'Neill and myself are making the argument that this is Sir Kenelm Digby. Digby is one of the more outstanding figures of early modern Britain. He was a privateer. He was the son of a gunpowder plot conspirator who became a privateer, a legal pirate, and after his successful career in piracy, retired and became an alchemist. So he's like, if you know D&D, he's a level 20 fighter mage. Yeah. And Kenelm Digby covers this book with distinct alchemical abbreviations, such as an O for aurum, for gold. Some of these I've been able to identify, and some of them seem to be distinct to Digby. For example, up here, we see the phrase Dies Petrum, the father of the gods, and the symbol for tin, written above it. Or Veneris, or Venus, here as well. And written here in this inscription it reads, Veris sensus intentionis quis libri est trium. The true sense of this book is threefold. The unfolding of all the energies of nature. Let's go to the copy you came here for, Buffalo. Buffalo has 5 annotators, more than any other. And this is one of my favorite pages in it. This is the Great Pyramid. This is an example of one of the structures in the Hypnerotomachia which could not be constructed in reality. The base of the pyramid is not figuratively, but literally miles wide. but this annotator covered the pyramid with annotation showing which features in it could be found in the book, The Classical Work on Architecture by Vitruvius. So he turns this pyramid into a conspectus of Vitruvian features, but then adds references to where those are found in other monuments throughout the book, turning this into a set of hyperlinks, or those old school DVD menus where you can click an element of the picture to take you to the scene in the movie. This is what we see here. So before delving in detail into the Buffalo copy, I'd like to talk a little bit about the plot of the HP, because it's been described by the medievalist Peter Dronke as one of the psychological heights of the genre of romance. It's not plotting or dull by any means. The plot begins when Poliphilo, an insomniac, due to his unrequited love for Paulia, finally falls asleep and wakes in a dream in a dark wood. Now, if this is familiar to you, you know Dante, because this is Dante's Divine Comedy also begins in a selva oscura, a dark wood. And here we have Poliphilo in the dark wood from the Buffalo copy and Gustave Doré's illustration of Dante's dark wood. After wandering in the dark wood for some time, he falls asleep again and enters a subdream, much like in Inception. And I've thinking about an idea for an article on Inception and the Hypnerotomachia, because I do think that Christopher Nolan was familiar with this text in creating this film. So he enters a dream within a dream, where things can be even more exaggerated than in your everyday dreams, and begins his journey through this dreamscape towards Paulia. He wanders through a landscape of lost monuments of antiquity. Some monuments, some of which are physically impossible to build in reality, that could only exist in the dream. And this symbolizes both the love and the mournfulness of Renaissance scholars for the classical world. The idea that it can never be recovered, but is this beloved source for their own scholarship. I'd love to show you some of the scenes in this book. It really merits reading. He goes by a garden made of glass, inscriptions to lost lovers, a dragon in an underground chamber, and a giant portal, as well as the Great Pyramid. And when he encounters these monuments, Poliphilo enters into rapturous, ecstatic descriptions of them, abounding in enthusiasm. These are called ekphrasis. An ekphrasis is an extended description of a work of art or a monument. And Poliphilo, in doing so, goes over the top from enthusiasm to sometimes even bordering on the erotic for buildings. So, as he's describing, he will do a rapturous description and then realize, oh, I've forgotten about Paulia, I need to resume my mission. So he's continually struggling with distraction, which is someone with ADD I very much relate to. This is a theme called the cupiditas rerum novarum, the lust or love of new things. And Poliphilo struggles constantly with his obsession with novelty and his long-term dedication towards Paulia. Finally, he arrives at her island, and this scene has been illustrated in a painting in the Getty Museum by Eustache Le Sueur, Marine Gods Paying Homage to Love. There you see Poliphilo's boat journeying past the gods of antiquity towards Kythera, or Cyprus, the island of Venus. But then when Poliphilo arrives at Kythera, the narrative reverses, and Paulia becomes the narrator, retelling the story in her own voice. And her view of the romance is completely different. Where Poliphilo sees himself as this almost chivalric, courtly lover, she sees him as an amusing and somewhat pitiable figure. And what's distinctive about Book 2 of the Hypnerotomachia is that you get an extended subjective narrative in a woman's voice in the Renaissance of her own experience of being objectified. Granted, all the proposed authors are male, but given that the text is anonymous and Francesco Colonna could be a pen name, the author could be of any gender. So here we have, for example, Paulia dragging Poliphilo, who has collapsed from lovesickness. Yeah. Yeah. Finally, however, right after the two are married, Paulia disappears. and Poliphili wakes up. And the novel ends on this very poetic phrase, Flos six execatus nunc fam reviscit. A flower once dried up will never be revived. And this ending on this melancholy, mournful note suggests the torn relationship of Renaissance scholars with antiquity, that it can never fully be recaptured, no matter how much they study. So I've suggested that the HP, or Hypnerotomachia, generates new literature, but it's also composed of other books. The book itself is like a collage of citations or references from other works. One of those works that's frequently referenced is Pliny's Natural History, one of the earliest encyclopedias and books on science. So in one scene, for example, where Poliphili compares his love sickness to having an epileptic seizure, one of the Buffalo annotators writes, "Epilepsy is the falling sickness," and finds the reference to falling sickness in Pliny's Natural History, finding the piece of Pliny which was recombined to make the Hypnerotomachia. Or, in another scene, Poliphili encounters a group of nymphs, and he describes in musicological terms the mode in which they're singing, the Phrygian mode. One of the annotators recognized that this came from Boethius' De Musica, an early medieval work on music. So what I'd like to suggest to you is that the Hypnerotomachia Poliphili is a dream narrative composed according to the psychological processes itself through which dreams are made, combining elements of our experience together into a narrative to have them make sense. This idea has been derived back to Sigmund Freud. If we're going to go back to the roots of psychology, in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud said that the dream is the place where no does not apply, where the policing function of the mind subdues, and we can picture literally anything without having to ask for permission. The exaggerated combined features of the Hypnerotomachia take advantage of this freedom that the dream space allows. So what kind of book do we have before us? We've got a book composed according to the logic of dreams, where no does not apply, remixing components from other books in a collage. What should we call such a book? Well, the Hypnerotomachia scholar Leon Lefebvre called this recombinant logic. The HB is continually recombining elements, creating a space for idea generation. The idea that with the Hypnerotomachia, we can think laterally, we can think creatively without having to worry about the boundaries that our conscious mind creates. It's as close to entering a lucid dream as you can in a waking state. But why would someone want to do this? Oops. Sorry, hit the wrong button here. Almost there. Why would you want to be able to create more creative ideas? Well, this was actually a business interest for Renaissance scholars. Renaissance scholars were known as humanists because they were scholars of the humanities. The word humanist had not yet acquired the secular connotations that it has today. And humanists, it's easy to forget when we idealize the Renaissance, had to make a living. They had to serve their patrons as composers, as poets, as secretaries. For them, their intellect and their wit was their bread and butter. It was how they made their money. So refining your wit, improving your ability to both recognize classical citations and combine them in creative ways was a career skill for a Renaissance humanist. And I want to suggest that reading the Hypnerotomachia was a way in which some humanists cultivated that skill. It was a distinctively productive place for combining elements. Now this is known as inventio in classical rhetoric, or the art of speaking, at least according to Quintilian, the Roman rhetoric master frequently studied in schools in the Renaissance. Inventio, or invention, is that stage in coming up with a new idea where you're assembling pieces of existing ideas, marshaling them together into a new argument. But to do inventio, you need to have a large repertoire of references to draw upon. We see the Buffalo annotator doing just this. This is the first page of the novel, in which a goddess known as Leucothea is referenced, an obscure Roman goddess. Here in the margin, the Leucothea is transliterated into Greek letters, and then it says the white goddess. So this annotator is building up their repertoire of classical references, getting one more god or goddess into their set of ideas they can work with. So knowledge and erudition, however, are not worth a whole lot unless they can be applied. So the skill of combining elements after inventio, putting them together into a new whole, was known as ingegno in Italian, or ingenuity, which was often translated as wit or in English, or esprit in French. And in the early modern period, there was this real focus on the development of wit. Wit was seen as a skill like any other which you could sharpen. And in fact, examples of well-practiced ingegno were known as acutezze, or sharpnesses. I want to give one example. This is an example of the pseudo-hieroglyphs in the HP, attempts at Egyptian hieroglyphics. But when Poliphili looks at this illustration, a cow head, a dolphin and an anchor, a ring, and so on, he comes up with an interpretation, a proverb. Can anyone make an inference what this might be? And your annotation is as valid as any others. What moral message might this be communicating?
A bird in hand is worth two in the bush.
Good one. I'll take it. You got the bird there? Any other thoughts what it can mean? Yep.
It's not something about it being easier for a dolphin to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich person to enter heaven. It's not that.
Brilliant. It could be a scriptural reference.
I don't know.
Well, as I said, there's not one encoded meaning. Your meaning is as valid as any other because you have become annotators of the Hypnerotomachia.
Fish, fowl, or four-legged beast are all good on the dinner.
I like that. I'll take it too. Well, the interpretation Poliphili gives is semper festina tarde. Always make haste slowly. In other words, hurry up but be careful about it. Which was also the workshop motto of Aldus Manutius, the printer of the Hypnerotomachia. These acutezze developed into a whole tradition of emblems, visual combinations of different elements which were used to make a moral argument. The most remarkable example of this is in a 1616 book called the Atalanta Fugiens. And here we have an inscription that reads, she who nourishes the world, or the nourisher of the world, where you have a nursing mother whose body is the planet Earth. Next to her is a nursing goat and Lupa the wolf with Romulus and Remus. So we see creating this mother goddess image using elements from different visual pieces, from astronomy, from classical antiquity, fused together into a new whole. So let's do some practice with this. Let's actually make an acutezze together. It was argued that effective ingegno was when you combined elements from disparate, widespread domains of experiences. For example, if I said love is like a red rose, a quote from Robert Burns, that's not an acutezze. Roses and love are frequently associated. But can you think of something we could put in the second box, which is from a completely different domain of experience, which could describe love?
Battlefield.
I like it.
That's what I thought.
Pat Benatar. Good. Nice.
I was thinking of the B word.
Yeah. I get that too.
A hot cup of tea.
Nice. These are all fine examples of acutezze. From pop culture to the coffee shop, we can combine, the more widespread the elements, the wittier the combination. And dreams are a great place to make acutezze because you can literally do anything you want. No matter how absurd the combination, you can make it work. And the Hypnerotomachia scholar Giovanni Pozzi called these lexical centaurs. A centaur being an impossible combination of man and beast, which nonetheless works. So we've got a book for training your ingegno, for sharpening your wit. What should we call such a book? It's got a narrative, it uses recognized characters, and it contains pen and ink games which readers can play, such as identifying the roots of words, which are not that hard in themselves, but maintain your attention. And so I like to call this an activity book. An activity book for Renaissance humanists. We've all had the experience of activity books as children, whether it's on the back of the Denny's menu or a book like this, where you've got pen and ink games which refine your intellectual abilities.
That's the New York Times puzzles.
Exactly, I like that. The New York Times crossword, very good. Can I borrow that example? Thank you so much. So, this might seem like a facetious comparison, but there is a precedent for it. Umberto Eco, the novelist who wrote The Name of the Rose, was an enthusiast for the Hypnerotomachia. And he wrote a novel called The Mysterious Flame of Queen Loana, which is about a rare book dealer who wrote his dissertation on the Hypnerotomachia. Now, I hope this is not presaging something, but he has a car accident and has an Oliver Sacks-style brain injury where the book dealer forgets everything about his life, experiences total amnesia, except for what he has read, which he remembers in its entirety. And that he must reconstruct his entire life only from his reading. The novel begins as a traditional written novel, but as you can see here, it gradually blends into a graphic novel by the end, till it becomes entirely a graphic novel. Because the rare book dealer realizes that while he could begin his journey by looking at the Hypnerotomachia and at great literature, the most meaningful texts he experienced were the comics he read as a child. So there is an association made by Umberto Eco between children's literature and the Hypnerotomachia. So let's look at the Buffalo copy as an activity book. We see readers marking up the margins, and it's traditional before going into the features of the object to look at its ownership history. Who might these annotators who might they have been? So this is the ownership history of the Buffalo copy as far as we can reconstruct. As you can see, there are some massive gaps. These can be identified from the ownership markings, the book plates, and ownership inscriptions. The only owners that seem to be annotators as well are the Jesuits of the College of Saint-Omer in Calais. And especially since some of the annotators we're going to see know Hebrew, it suggests it could be a very learned Jesuit annotator as well. It's unknown how the book entered the Grosvenor collections. It could have been bought by a wealthy Buffalonian when the city was at its height as a center of the railroad industry. It's also been said that the two world wars were like taking the aristocracy of Europe, holding them upside down and shaking out their pockets of their collections. So this could also be a post-war acquisition. We just don't know. So let me walk you through the three hands in Buffalo. The three initial hands, and then two more. The first hand of the five, I should have said, wrote in French and black ink, summarizing the narrative as Ben Jonson did in the British Library copy. The second hand wrote in French and is the only hand so far I've found who could read Hebrew. The Hypnerotomachia is mostly composed of Italian and Latin in Polifilesco, but it also contains Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic inscriptions. Hand C is also a summarizer, but they're interested in signposting the narrative, taking the density of Polifilesco and making it navigable. Hand D is instead writing in Italian rather than French, which suggests that the book returned to Italy at some point in its history before arriving in England. This hand argues back to previous hands, crossing off the French annotations it disagrees with on architecture and writing in its own comments. But probably the most out there hand is hand E. This notes writing in Latin in a much larger script, and it applies an alchemical reading to Hypnerotomachia, just as Kenelm Digby did in the British Library copy. It labels passages with the ingredient or process it presumes to allegorize, inferring a recipe in the subtext of the book. What I find extraordinary about this is that this alchemical reading validates an interpretation of the Hypnerotomachia put forward by Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst. In his book Psychology and Alchemy, Jung argued that the Hypnerotomachia is an allegory of alchemy, because for Jung, he did not see alchemy as a laboratory procedure. He thought that if any laboratory ingredients, if there were any, were just props for what's actually an inner work. That alchemy is not about refining lead into gold, it's about removing the dross from your soul and making your soul golden. becoming individuated, becoming your most perfect self. Jung also may have used the Hypnerotomachia as a source for his concepts of animus and anima, the masculine and feminine principles he inferred within the human psyche. So the Buffalo copy validates, at least in general terms, Carl Jung's reading. But what kind of alchemy are we looking at? There are various schools of alchemy. We can find a clue in the elephant and obelisk image we looked at earlier. It's easy to forget when looking through the images of the Hypnerotomachia that these monuments are not in linear order. They're in a three-dimensional space. And it's a fun but exhausting mental task trying to hold in your mind's eye how all these objects are related to each other within this virtual reality dreamscape. So here we see a change of camera angle. Here's the elephant, you notice, has a headdress. The camera angle switches 90 degrees and looks straight on at the headdress, which has an inscription in Greek, gonos kai euthuia, labor and industry. But beneath that inscription is the phrase, Geber ingenium subtile, Geber of subtle ingenio, or creativity. Who's Geber? Oops. Hey, Jeb. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button here. Geber is the Latinization of Jabir ibn Hayyan, a 8th century Shia alchemist, most likely from Persia. There's a long argument about whether there was a single individual named Jabir ibn Hayyan or whether this is a pen name used by a group of alchemists. But nevertheless, the Jabirian corpus, the body of his work, was translated in large part into Latin, and his name was Latinized from Jabir into Geber. One of the things that makes Geber's alchemy stand out is that he doesn't see the elements as distinct entities. He sees them as gradations of each other. So gold and silver are not separate elements. Gold is silver in its height, silver is gold in its depth. And uses the analogy of the sun and the moon being the same size to the human eye. The elements are like yin and yang of each other. One way we can see that the annotator is using a Jabirian scheme of alchemy is in the scene of a human chess match, which has been argued to be the first depiction of a human chess match in literature. The two pieces are labeled gold and silver teams. And as the pieces knock each other out, the pawns get captured, this annotator apparently saw that as a symbol of refinement of metals, cutting away the dross to get to silver and gold. So we see this one inscription, it says, Iaco discaci, the game of chess, and it says, Rex ex argento factus, the king made out of silver remains the victor, at least in the second round. Gold triumphs in the end. So I'd like to close by inviting you to read the Hypnerotomachia. It is eminently readable. It is a great translation in 1999 by Jocelyn Godwin, the esoteric scholar, and it is fun to read aloud. It's over the top, it's opulent, it really lends itself to performance. I'd also like to suggest to you that the Poliphilesque, if we could call it, is more than just a book and more than just a style. It's a mode of thinking, it's a mindset, a disposition to life, where we combine creativity and erudition with ingenuity and passion. And one way we see this coming out is in a rewriting of the Hypnerotomachia that was written by the architect Alberto Perez Gomez called Polifilo, The Dark Forest Revisited, An Erotic Epiphany of Architecture, where he rewrites the Hypnerotomachia, but Polifilo is not journeying past the monuments of classical antiquity, he's journeying through mini-malls and airports and the banal postmodern architecture of our day, trying to reinfuse it with passion and life and vigor. So if this presentation has encouraged you to go and read the Hypnerotomachia, I certainly encourage you to do so. And I'd be very open to your questions. Thank you very much, everyone. My pleasure. Thank you.
Where can we read your dissertation?
Sure, it's right at this link.
Okay.
Academia.edu. It's or just Google James Russell Hypnerotomachia and it'll come up.
Okay.
We have a second mic now. If anyone else has a question they'd like to ask Dr. Russell. Okay.
Yes.
You mentioned in your presentation about the known owners, previous owners of this copy. And specifically in 1827, Fletcher, and I couldn't get his last name.
Raincock.
Okay. He noted the book in his catalog, or wherever that reference was found, as being unblemished. Now, what do you think that meant, unblemished, in that context, knowing that this copy already had all these annotations, which some might consider blemishes?
Yes, it was a real pity that in the 19th century annotations were considered blemishes. They'd be washed out, they'd be cut off. You'd see books that were cropped or trimmed, leaving out valuable annotation, which is a horror from the view of modern day scholarship. I got to see a copy annotated that's in Williams College in Massachusetts, and I had to use an ultraviolet light to see the annotation because they had been washed out. This copy I thought was a perfect copy. It's actually missing one page, the cutout title page. But it does have two pages which are usually missing. The first page that's often torn out of the Hypnerotomachia is the last page, the errata, which is the list of mistakes in the book for the annotator, for the reader to fix. Movable type is an inexact science. There's almost always mistakes, and you're expected to fix them yourself. But the colophon is also the only place where it says that the book was published in 1499. Because if you tear that page out, the only other date in the book is 1467, the day that Polia disappeared on May Day. However, that can look like the date of publication if the last page is removed. So unscrupulous book dealers would remove the last page to pass it off as an earlier copy. The other page that's often removed is an image of nymphs sacrificing to the god of phalluses, Priapus, which is very graphic. So I left it out of this family presentation, but I'd be happy to show it to you in the original copy.
Is that your questions? Thank you.
Thank you for your very fascinating talk.
Thank you.
What do you make of the fact that this copy, or I'm assuming this copy, ended up at the Jesuit college in Saint-Omer, which was for English recusants?
Great question. The college, the association with recusancy are Catholics who refuse to become Anglican. I never made that association before. Thank you so much for that insight. I hadn't thought about that before at all, and I'm good. Can I borrow that insight from you? Thank you. Yeah, sure, let's do. It is interesting, though, that college was closed at the suppression of the Jesuits. And the college later relocated, when political winds had shifted, back to England as Stonyhurst College. And that could have been the moment when the book transitioned back
Hello
to
and welcome
Britain.
to the Downtown Central Library. We're glad you're here. Did you know we have free public computers, Wi-Fi, a recording studio, and more? If you need any assistance, please see a staff member.
The staff members are awesome.
Okay, here's our next question.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm
Thank you.
curious about your inception theory, and you mentioned like Polyphia waking up, but does the sub-dream ever get mentioned, and where do dreams fit in Polia's part of the story?
Good question. When he wakes up, he seems to have woken up out of both dreams. He doesn't incrementally move back up through, I think there's 4 stages of sub-dream in inception. He goes back straight away to waking consciousness. The notion of Polia's section being in the dream is also very complicating, because we have a female character who's portrayed as the fantasy of the male protagonist, speaking in her own voice in a book that is more likely to, but not provably, written by someone male. So the gender dynamics within this book are very complicated. Though Polia's narrative is really fun because she really skewers courtly love and idealization. She does no truck with being put on a pedestal. And that is one of the things I find really encouraging about her, though she is still existing within Polyphilo's sub-dream. Sure.
You showed a woodcut of Polonius, the female character, pulling the male character out of the dream. And it looked like she was pulling him past an altar.
Yeah.
Meaning there?
Good question. Let me scroll up to that image.
What's your feeling about that?
My initial impression of that was that it was a bed, but Oh, no, actually, actually, I was wrong with that. That is the altar, because that could be some evidence as to the Venetian Dominican. Because he's very knowledgeable about the equipment of liturgy. He does descriptions of candles and braziers and monstrances and incense devices with as much detail as he does buildings. So that could be one more argument for the Venetian Colonna.
That is very much what you would see as a private altar or a side altar.
Yeah.
Go to the Basilica here in Western New York in Lackawanna. Yes.
Thanks for that suggestion, and I'm going to take it on board.
How about the altar of love?
Good idea.
It looks like she's dragging him to the bedroom.
Oh, well, that's possible.
Yes.
This is just to participate in this same line
Please
of
do.
questioning that I'm so glad people are raising about the status of Polia's narrative and the question of the framed dreams. I also think we really shouldn't sleep on what Carl Jung sees in this. I absolutely love that you're bringing in psychoanalytic thought. I have so much to ask you about. This is one of the best things I've ever seen in my life.
Thank you.
And I think there's a really rich reading available here that Polia is a kind of feminine self.
Yes.
And one of the really interesting directions that early modern studies is going in right now is acknowledging that not everyone who wrote or dreamed in the past was cisgender.
Certainly.
Or what we would now call completely cisgender. So I think that's another really rich, what's his name? Francesco Colonna loved Polia greatly. That there's a reading available here where Polia is Polia dragging Polyphilis through some kind of portal of gender recognition, gender transition. I think Jung saw this there.
Yeah, there's a great book called The Dream of Polyphilo, The Soul in Love by Linda Fiers-David, who's one of Jung's students, where she goes in detail about Polyphilo and Polia being animus and anima. There's a copy here in the Buffalo Library. It's in non-circulating stacks, but you can get a copy of it. It's also thinking about moving beyond a gender binary. In alchemy, there's the idea of the alchemical hermaphrodite, that the male and female principles end up coalescing into a figure which transcends both genders. And that is one way in which we can see a more liberatory reading of this, looking at the alchemical hermaphrodite not as just a chemical stage in the process, but as an example of somebody moving beyond the binary in the early modern period.
I've heard that, and this particular image makes me think of this, that Leon Battista Alberti, the architect, was maybe the illustrator of some of these buildings that appear in it, that they're the first examples of architecture in a printed book. And in this particular case, this is very modern architecture for its day. And in fact, it makes me think of the San Marco Library.
Yes.
With those iron tie rods and the whole thing. And the first, it's a very early example, I think, at least in printed form, of perspective. That somebody is using this dream world to make it appear extremely realistic. Do you have any thoughts about who might have been involved with the architecture?
Yes, Leon Lefebvre, who came up with the idea of the Hypnerotomachia being recombinant logic, argues that Leon Battista Alberti is in fact the author.
Of the book, yes.
Yeah, of the book. I don't find that entirely persuasive because Alberti died in 1471. The book was published in 1499, and such close, intimate relation between the woodcut and the typography suggests to me that the author was there to see it through the press alive. However, the jury is still out on the author, and I think that Lefebvre's argument and her book has unfortunately been dismissed too casually. The idea that people looked at the book and said, well, it can't be Alberti, so that her book was discounted by critics, but her idea of it being a recombinant, fusing book that is used for idea generation was very much a new insight. And there are a lot of Albertian resonances throughout the book. Whoever Francesco Colonna was, they certainly knew Alberti, who was a uomo universale, a universal man, a universal genius.
You talked about this book being a sort of activity book of its time. Do you have any other books that you would say belongs in the same category, or would you say this book is wholly unique in that?
This is the current research question I'm working on. I've not found direct parallels, which seems it could be a distinctive object in itself. There was a genre of literature called whetstones of wit, which were collections of puzzle books that were popular throughout the 16th and 17th century for refining your ingenio. I think that we can make connections to the whetstone of wit tradition, but those aren't dream narratives. So I don't want to say it's a unique object yet, but I have not yet found a parallel for it. And one of my current strains of research is trying to find, are there parallels to this for other books? Do people annotate the Atalantafugians, for example, the emblem book, in the same way they annotated the Hypnerotomachia?
Prior to hearing about this book, I had heard about or read about a modern book called The Ship of Theseus, which kind of takes this multiple authors annotating and kind of sub-stories kind of pulled out by authors after the book is printed. Is there much connection between The Ship of Theseus book and the HP?
Thanks for that reading recommendation. I have to say I've not yet read Ship of Theseus, but I'm now going to, from what you said, because I'm interested in the ways that this is very much like a postmodern narrative. It's non-linear, it jumps around, it possibly has multiple authors, and the Great Pyramid image, which is here in the Buffalo copy, is actually a set of what you could call hyperlinks, where he references every architectural feature found in other monuments, enabling you to do like early hypertext poetry and when the internet came out in the 90s, jumping from one section to section without having to move straight from beginning to end. So I'm going to go try to find a copy of The Ship of Theseus. Thank you for that recommendation.
I just want to add one thing. Another cool element about it is that it's not just marginalia written in different ink colors, but there's also like things that were used as bookmarks and like tickets and things that help.
Ephemera.
Yeah, ephemera in it as well.
Yeah, there's a lot been studied around paratexts, which are things like bindings, covers, wrappings, and how those contribute to the meaning of books as well. Other books which have been argued to be inspired by the Hypnerotomachia, not just the Rule of Four, James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, written in a constructed language as well, and Daniel Lusky's House of Leaves has been compared to it as well.
So I'm going to lift up, we pulled a cart aside with most of the so Dr. Russell did send us a list of texts in the circulating collection here, and so we pulled them aside in a cart over there if anyone wants to check out some of the books that were discussed in the presentation today. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy of House of Leaves in this library, but I do suggest, it's in the system, it's just out in the branches. You can refer it and we'll send it to your local branch, but we didn't have it on hand for today. Any other questions?
I have one question.
Please.
Do you see any correlation between the dreamscape and what they call the Acacia record for as alchemy goes?
I'm not familiar with the Acacia record.
Oh, Edgar Casey used to use it.
Oh, Edgar Casey.
Yeah, he used to use it. He'd access it to get information that he needed.
That's a great idea. Oh, the Akashic record.
Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that because there is a long period of reception of the HP and the history of esotericism by people like Edgar Casey, the American visionary, and other people involved in the esoteric. For example, one of the nymphs is named Thelema, which means the will, and Aleister Crowley, the great occultist, developed a new religion called Thelema, which it's been argued he got that root from the HP. So people like Crowley made use of this text as well. So there is I'm not familiar with the connection to Casey, but there is a long esoteric reception I'm glad you brought up.
One thing that I really appreciated in reading some of your thesis, so I will lift up, someone said, how can we see more about your thesis? You can find it online very easily, but we do have a reference copy in the rare book room as well. You can't check it out, but you can come in and read it. But one thing I really took away when I was reading your thesis was that this is a pedagogic text, right? This was a text similar to an activity book, like that's, this recurring language, but it was one interpretation is that it was to help the reader get comfortable with thinking abstractly, right? Like in a world that is both very tangible and all around you, how do you start to kind of build a postmodern consciousness in someone living in 1499, right? And what it is to kind of create a text that helps people expand in those ways.
Certainly. I love the idea that it's a book that's pedagogical, not only in the skills it trains, but when it encourages you to read. This book is like a nexus point for your library. It makes you start reading it, and then you find a reference to Pliny and go and read Pliny. So it's almost like you can be spun out in different reading directions from it, which is why I'm so glad that we have books available to borrow today, inspired by or adjacent to the HP, which you can check out right over there. Yeah.
Oh, everyone, this is so special. So before we clap on our final clap for Dr. Russell, I do just want to lift up how we even met in person. So
Yeah.
I had read Dr. Russell's thesis because I have a copy of it in my office. It was there because of my predecessor who worked with Amy Pickard, who worked with Dr. Russell when he came to visit years ago. And so I was reading, because I was trying to understand when I first started this job, what is this text? What is this totally bizarre text that I can't even pronounce the name of? And his thesis was my first real foray into understanding the depths of it. And I was absolutely fascinated. It was written in a very accessible and present language. And then a year and a half goes by, and I was in some sort of, webinar about book history and that sort of thing. And I introduce myself in the webinar, and then I get a little note in the side chat that says, "Oh, you're in Buffalo. I'm James. I came to Buffalo to see this text years ago." And so we met in a webinar, and then started talking afterwards. And I will lift up. I first even proposed just a remote lecture, but Dr. Russell was so eager to come out and to be present today that he really took on a lot of the responsibility to make this happen. So I just really want to honor that as part of what you brought here today, that your devotion to this text is so present, and I am just grateful beyond measure for you for making this time. So now we clap. Let us all clap. So now we're going to pull up basically the part of the text you could look at is over there, but we are now going to prepare to show you the text, and we're going to take the lid off this case here. So here's how this is going to go. I would like everyone to feel that they could take a turn to get to be able to see it, so do be aware, kind of making a sort of wider circle here. We're going to take the lid off of this.